So we recently received the news that Israel murdered 5 Al Jazeera journalists, among them Anas Al-Sharif, who was a very well-known correspondent for Al Jazeera. Joining us now to discuss his work and this all-out assault on journalists is Sharif Abdel Kouddous. He is the MENA editor for Dropsite News. Great to see you, Sharif.
Good to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. So you interviewed Anas back several months back. I remember reading this piece. We can put this up on the screen, actually, about what it had been like for him covering this genocide. You say Israel's genocide in Gaza every day for 11 straight months. You know, what was it like interacting with him, and what did you make of the comments he made at that time and his legacy that he's left behind?
There are no words. I don't know what to say anymore. Words aren't enough at this point. Action is required. Words did not save Anas Al-Sharif and his colleagues. And there's a certain level of brazenness now that how Israel is killing these journalists. And I just want to tell people the other journalists' names. So Israel bombed a media tent opposite, just outside of Shifa Hospital, intentionally killing Anas Al-Sharif. And Mohammed Qareqa, who is also a correspondent for Al Jazeera, and camera operators Ibrahim Zohir, Mu'min Alewa, and Mohammed Nufal. And there was a 6th journalist also killed who worked for an outlet called Sahat, who's Mohammed Al-Khalidi. Anas, he was, at just 28 years old, he was probably the most prominent Palestinian journalist who is still alive and still in Gaza reporting, a face recognizable across the Arab world and internationally. He remained in the north throughout the entire 22-month genocidal assault, one of just a handful of journalists who never left the north. And he was a near constant presence on television, online, reporting almost every day on airstrikes, shelling, massacres, displacement, famine, death, dismemberment, and whenever he could on glimpses of hope and resilience, Palestinian resilience. And Israel assassinated him. Anas's last tweet to his more than 560,000 followers, just before he was killed, he said, "Relentless bombardment. For 2 hours, the Israeli aggression has intensified on Gaza City." And we know that Israel's security cabinet approved Netanyahu's plan to take control of Gaza City in the latest escalation of this genocide. Barely an hour earlier, before he was killed, he warned about this. He said Israel's planning a full-scale invasion of Gaza City. And I'm just going to quote, he said, "If this madness does not end, Gaza will be reduced to ruins, its people's voices silenced, their faces erased, and history will remember you as silent witnesses to a genocide you chose not to stop." And he said silence is complicity. And barely an hour later, he's killed. And it's not just silence. I mean, the world's governments, corporations, media elites have not just stood by as Israel's committing these acts of genocide. They have enabled it. There's now 238 journalists killed, according to the government media office in Gaza. 238. These journalists have been bombed, they've been shot, they've been burned alive, they've been decapitated, they've been taunted and targeted. And that's not to mention the journalists wounded, the journalists imprisoned, the journalists who made this impossible decision to leave Gaza because life was no longer sustainable there. And in a very, very real way, the only reason we know about what is happening in Gaza is because of Palestinian reporters who are performing the most heroic act of journalism we will see in our lifetimes. And they're being intentionally slaughtered and intentionally targeted for this. And the Israeli military, I have to remind people, the Israeli military was openly and publicly threatening, and he said this in the interview I did with him, openly and publicly threatening Anas Al-Sharif for months. Back in November of 2023, he reported receiving calls from Israeli officers telling him to cease his coverage, telling him to leave the north and go south, getting location messages on his WhatsApp as threats. They bombed his, after he got those location threats, they bombed his house in Jabalia, killing his 90-year-old father. And the threats only escalated from there. Last October, he was one of 6 Al Jazeera journalists that Israel put on what is essentially a hit list, saying that they're all militants and taunting them online. One of them was Hossein Shabet, who used to report for Dropsite, and he was assassinated in March. And the Israeli military boasted about his killing and said, quote, "Don't let the press vest fool you." And then the Israeli military continued to openly threaten Enes, especially in the last couple of weeks. Enes himself repeatedly called on the world to do something. Just a couple of weeks ago, he posted that he was being threatened, and he said this is an attempt to silence us, to cover up a genocide unfolding in real time. And he said, quote, "I call on international officials, human rights defenders, and global media to speak out and share this message. Your voice can help stop the targeting of journalists and protect the truth."
Wow, Sharif,
And
I mean, one of the things that has been hypothesized here is that Anas was killed largely because right now is when Israel is moving into Gaza City. And we also want to highlight, you know, what you said there about the number of journalists who have actually been killed. Can we put C4, please, up on the screen just to show everybody the context and the number of journalists who have been killed here in this conflict? And you can just see it's overwhelming, you know, in terms of the Gaza war compared to Ukraine, the war in Afghanistan, the Yugoslav wars in Vietnam. It's unprecedented in modern history, and particularly, you know, by a so-called civilized nation.
yeah, I mean, I think Israel essentially yesterday wiped out Al Jazeera's Gaza City correspondents and crew and journalistic crew ahead of this what is expected to be a horrific invasion of Gaza City to ethnically cleanse Gaza City and forcibly displace everyone there again to the south. And you know, losing Enes and losing these other journalists, we are going to know less about what is happening as this is unfolding. And yeah, there's something also just so horrific that journalists like Enes and Hossein Shabet, who used to report for Dropsite, he pre-wrote a message anticipating his death.
Yeah.
That he knew would be published after he was killed. Can you imagine working in these circumstances? He's 28 years old.
Right.
Knowing you're going to be killed and knowing that the world is likely not going to stop it. You know, and in his message, he says some very important things. He says that he was born in Jabalia, the refugee camp. He reminds people that he dreamed that his family could return to their land and home that they were expelled from in 1948 in what is now at the Israeli town of Ashkelon or Al-Majdal. He reminds people that most Palestinians in Gaza are not from Gaza, they're refugees. And then he writes of the suffering that you know, he bore witness to and that he also endured. And he again, you know, kind of points the finger at the world that watched this happen and is watching this happen and is allowing it to happen. And those were his final words to the world. And he said, you know, don't forget us. And when I spoke to him and asked him, you know, he sent like a 10-minute voice note response. His voice was wary but firm. And, you know, I asked him, why do you keep doing this? And he said, I'll also quote from him. I'm sorry I'm quoting so much from him, but I think his words are important. He said, maybe the world won't act. Maybe the world won't help us. But there might be a motive to stop this war. Every time I document a massacre or event or bombing, I think that maybe through this bombing or this image, that the war could stop and this war could end. This drives us to continue in our coverage to our last breath. And he did it to his last breath.
Well, and we know Israel considered him dangerous. That's why and the information he was sharing with the world, dangerous. That's why they assassinated him and his 4 colleagues working for Al Jazeera. And the other thing that's really disgusted me, Sharif, is the way that Western media has given Israel a pass. They have not stood in solidarity with these Palestinian journalists. There have been pieces, you know, think pieces written about, well, do they even really count as journalists? You know, so much credence given to consistent Israeli claims that, oh, well, they're really Hamas, which is preposterous. Like, you can see this guy out there doing his job literally every single day. At what point does he have time to go and be a Hamas militant alongside live streaming his own, you know, genocide and ultimately murder at the hands of the Israelis every single day? So that's been one of the things that's really disgusted me. And there's been a consistent drumbeat, too, of Israel needs to let in the Western journalists. And unfortunately, I think because of, anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian racism, I do think that those images being shared by Western journalists may have more of an impact. But it shouldn't be that way. There are journalists in Palestine. There are journalists in Gaza. It just happens that most of them are Palestinian. So they're dismissed and their work is minimized or called into question as to their motives oftentimes by liberal Western media figures.
Look, I mean, I think international journalists should absolutely be allowed into Gaza, not because we can question at all the veracity and the strength of reporters in Palestine, in Gaza, who are doing this, but for two reasons. One is to shoulder the labor of covering this war. They are covering this genocide absolutely by themselves.
Yep.
And I think it's incumbent on international journalists to help them in this coverage.
Yep.
The second thing is, because of this racism, because of the way that Western media institutions and Western governments see Palestinian journalists, foreign journalists going in will act as a shield in a certain way, as a shield to people in Gaza, as a shield to Palestinian journalists. And I think that's why they need to go in. The reaction to Anas's killing, I'm still somehow shocked by it, even though I shouldn't be after so long, by Western media institutions. The National Press Club called for a thorough and transparent examination of the circumstances surrounding Anas's death. What on earth does that mean? They're putting out a boilerplate statement calling for an investigation. Israel openly, publicly threatened him for months. Yeah. They bombed the tent he was in, and then they took credit for it and bragged about it.
Yeah.
What investigation are you talking about?
That's exactly
Reuters, the headline of Reuters is, Israel kills Al Jazeera journalist it says was Hamas leader. And then it goes on to quote the Israeli military saying, he was responsible for advancing rocket attacks or some of this, preposterous claims. This is making this... It's enabling Israel to do this.
That's right.
And if we look, there's been a progression of brazenness of how Israel kills journalists in Palestine. In the beginning, they would deny that they killed them, or they would say it's collateral damage, or that it was some mistake. Then they started claiming that the journalists were in fact militants after they killed them. They did this with Hamza Dahdouh in January 2024. They produced some ridiculous documents claiming he's a Hamas militant or Islamic Jihad, I don't remember. Then they continued to step it up. They created this hit list in October, and they put 6 Al Jazeera journalists and basically saying openly, we're going to kill them, and now they've killed 2 of them. They went even further. In April, they targeted one of the most prominent journalists in Gaza. His name was Hassan Aslayah. They bombed him in a very similar way to the bombing they did yesterday. They bombed a media tent, but this one outside of Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis. They killed 2 journalists. One was burned alive and the other died. But the journalist they were trying to kill, Hassan, he was wounded very badly. He was burned. He lost 2 of his fingers. He was recovering inside the hospital. They bombed the hospital and killed him. They bombed an injured journalist barely a month later, and killed him. And then openly admitted to it. So they're becoming more brazen about it, openly admitting to it, because they know there will be 0 consequences.
Yeah. No, that's what they do. They push the limit.
They might get some words of condemnation, but the money, the weapons, the support, and the coverage by most Western media outlets will allow this to happen.
That's right. True. That's right. No, that's what they do. They test the limits, and every time, what they found is they can get away with literally anything. Sharif, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Appreciate it, man.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.